Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about how to be the best GM you can be. Um, or, in other words, trying to figure out your game master identity. There are lots of YouTubers out there and videos talking about the fundamentals of being a GM, tons of GMing advice. What I'm hoping to do today is fill in something that I feel has been missing in the discussion. Because there is a lot of conventional and common advice out there. You see it on YouTube, you see it in the different online forums, that while well-meaning, I think misses some important stuff. So I'm hoping to talk about some of that today. Now, this video is not going to be how to be a GM. There are so many videos out there. So I'm not going to focus on that. I can't help but talk a little bit about it, only because it's hard to have this discussion without having sort of a common sort of framework or language. By nature, I'm sort of a researcher. You know, when I want to know something, I hunt down videos, blogs. I really try to sort of absorb as much information as I can on a topic. And so I'm going to share some of what I've picked up from that with you today. One question you might be having is, well, why the heck would I listen to you? And I'm not saying you even should. Just to give you a little bit of background, I've been GMing for probably over 10 years now. I've probably GM'd more than I've actually been a player in a game. What I'm going to share today is a sort of the combination of what I've, learned through researching, what I've, sort of discovered as a GM myself, and just things that I've observed in being a player in games, seeing other people GM, and having discussions with other GMs. So hopefully some of this will be useful, but don't take my word for it. Do the research, watch other videos, read other blogs, see what other people are saying. There's going to be a lot of people out there who are going to tell you the right way to run your game. But to be honest, that's the right way for them to run their game. You need to figure out what works for you, and to do that, you need to know your GM identity. And that's what today is going to be all about. But before I can really talk about that, I do need to talk a little more basic stuff about GMing. So specifically, in order to be a good or solid GM, you need to have decent GM fundamentals. There are lots of videos that will go into detail about different aspects of gaming. Maybe a decent starting point is a video that I actually saw recently. It was the DMs, it was by the DM Lair, and it was like the the 9 Dungeon Master Secrets. Definitely worth checking out. It's not a bad starting point for figuring out what you may want to sort of look deeper into as you go on this sort of journey of becoming a game master. But there are some things that I do feel are key to being a game master. Many of you probably have one of these, the Dungeon Master Guide. And let's be honest, there's good information in here, and there's a lot of stuff that will help you run your game, but it doesn't really explain to you how to be a game master, how to think like a game master. There's not a lot of books out there that do that. One of the ones that was recommended to me way back in the beginning was Robbins Laws, and it was a solid book. But there's actually a newer book out that I would actually recommend to anyone just starting out being a GM, and it's Game Angry. This is a book by Scott Rem, The Angry GM, and honestly, I think it does a really nice job of breaking down the fundamentals and help you to start thinking like a GM. He's got a really nice approach, and I'm going to talk about his blog momentarily. If you weren't necessarily a fan of his blog, the book actually does a nice job of taking all the information from the early years of his blog, but removing a lot of the shtick and expressing thoughts in a more concise way. But honestly, I can't recommend this book enough for new GMs just starting out. I think if you read this and start practicing some of the stuff in here, you're going to be starting off on the right foot and well on your way to becoming a solid GM. There are lots of YouTubers out there who do a great job of talking about D&D. One of my favorites is Matthew Colville. He runs a really great YouTube channel. For folks looking to homebrew and use house rules, Dungeon Coach is another really great option. I've actually enjoyed Ginny D's videos, the DM Lair, Dungeon Craft. These are all great YouTube channels that will help you start to think like a GM. And what I like about it is a bunch of different people. It's a bunch of diverse perspectives because you don't want to necessarily just try and copycat one person. You want to sort of pull from lots of different people in order to develop your best approach at GMing. And your best approach may not necessarily be the approach someone else uses. And we're going to talk about why that distinction is important. Another thing that I think can be helpful is watching Critical Role. It's one of the most popular and famous sort of role play channels out there in terms of getting to watch actual live play by a professional GM and also professional players. Now, just a sort of a word of caution on that, I think sometimes that show can give a little bit of a high standard of what to expect in a D&D game. So just bear that in mind. These are professional voice actors, and they are doing a channel and putting on a show for people. So there's going to be certain sort of streamlined elements, I think, to what they do that you're not necessarily going to see in a typical game, in somebody's home or, online or something. So that's just something to bear in mind. But one of the other reasons why I mentioned Critical Role is there's actually a number of YouTube channels out there where people actually will break down the episodes and they'll talk about the things that Matt's doing. So they actually go through and sort of try and put themselves into the head of Matt Mercer and talk about how he's running the game, how he's approaching different elements. And I actually think those YouTube channels are actually a little bit more helpful than the actual Critical Role episodes themselves. Though the two in conjunction with one another, I think can actually provide a really nice sort of learning platform for those wanting to be a GM. Just bear in mind, I'm not Matt Mercer, you're not Matt Mercer. We're not professional voice actors. So there's going to be a big difference between how we run things versus how he's able to do things. So that's just something to bear in mind. Another great avenue for learning how to be a GM are various blogs. My two favorites, I like Sly Flourish. He's got a lot of basic stuff in there about being a GM. I also like, if you decide to run, one of Wizard's adventure paths. He actually does a lot of stuff regarding how to enhance those adventure paths, how to customize them, things that you can do to make them better, which for one of the ones I ran in the past, I found incredibly useful. So he has a really nice blog with a lot of great information. The other one that I cannot recommend enough and is my actual personal favorite is the Angry GM. Now, if you go into different online forums, you're going to find a little bit of a divided sort of attitude. Some people love him, some people hate him. The thing to remember about the Angry GM's blog is, he does have the angry shtick. That's his gimmick in terms of being a blogger. So you have to kind of be able to look past it. I personally find it funny. Other people find it tiresome. But honestly, it doesn't take away from the good information he's providing you. Because one of the things that I think he does that a lot of other bloggers don't do is not only does he give you sort of suggestions on how to run a better game, he goes through the entire thought process from, what made him decide to look at this in the first place, what logic did he apply to coming up with the solutions that he did, and then finally, ultimately, his conclusions. He actually sort of walks you through how to think like a GM. It's very logical, which very much appeals to me, who's a very logic-based person. But it does a really nice job. Some people say he's long-winded, but I think it's because he's actually explaining everything from the conception of the idea to his final result. And I think that's the part about his blog that I don't think everyone fully realizes is probably the most valuable part, is he's not just spoon feeding you information, he's actually explaining how he arrived there. What thought process did he use? And I think that's one of the things that makes his blog one of the most powerful ones available. Because, a lot of other, articles and blogs that you're going to read out there are short. They get right to the point. And don't get me wrong, that's useful, especially for certain topics. But it doesn't necessarily always show you. It's kind of like with math in school. Teachers always told you, like, when you're doing math problems, always show your work. That's what the Angry GM does. He shows the work, how he got from point A to point B. A lot of other articles will state what the problem is and then their solution, but they don't necessarily always go through that process in between with how they arrived there. And so it's one of the things I think that really sets his blog apart from everyone else's. So needless to say, can't recommend it enough. Go read it, become a better GM. It's one of the things that helped me become a better GM. And I think this all ties into something that I think is very important when it comes to fundamentals and being a good GM. Never stop learning. The moment you think you know it all as a GM, you failed as a GM. I am constantly, watching blogs, watching videos, reading blogs, because I'm trying to become better as a GM, because I'm not the best. I don't know everything. I'm a human being. I have strengths, I have weaknesses. I try to play to my strengths and I try to improve my weak areas, as any good solid GM should. And this idea of strengths and weaknesses is one that I'm going to come back to because I think it is fundamental to figuring out who you are as a GM. But keep on learning. And then I'm also going to give you a bit of caution. I'm on Facebook in the groups all the time, on Reddit, and there are tons of people with tons of opinions. And they're going to tell you the right way and the only way you should be running your game. Don't listen to them. Listen to them because they might give you some things to think about and things to consider, but don't necessarily drink the Kool-Aid. One person's opinion about the right way to run a game might be the one and only way for them to run a game. And it's what's worked for them. It's built into their identity as a GM. It doesn't necessarily need to define your identity as a GM. And like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about that, but be careful about it. And I don't think it's the advice you're going to see online, and even heck, the advice I'm giving you right now, it's not necessarily bad advice, but it's just one person's perspective. And you want to make sure that, as you are finding your identity, that you're considering who you are as a player, as a GM, as well as multiple other sources of GMing information. And you're going to refine that down to who you are specifically and what works best for you. Because everyone's going to tell you what works best for them. And they're going to preach it to you like it's gospel. But it's just one opinion, one approach. And if I can't emphasize one thing enough, it's this. You don't have to run the game the way someone else does. You want to figure out the best way for you to run your game. Okay. So how do you discover your identity as a GM? I'm not going to say this is easy, but I think some of it starts with really figuring out who you are as a player. In the book of Robbins Laws, he has, a chapter on talking about different kinds of players, like, power gamers, storytellers. The Angry GM did a very similar thing. In an article, he labeled the 8 different kinds of fun. What's nice about, that chapter in these articles is it sort of acknowledges that there's different kinds of players who focus on different things in the game. You have some folks who are all about the rules. You have some folks who are all about building powerful characters who are going to do heroic things. Some players who are all about the story. Some players who are all about method acting and getting into a role. There are those who are just there for the social aspects and to hang out. There's all different kinds of players. And what's important about this is how those individuals engage with the game. It's what they enjoy, it's what excites them, it's what brings them to the D&D fold, or any role-playing fold for that matter. And this is important because chances are, maybe before thinking about being a GM, you were a player. And who you are as a player is going to inform who you end up being as a GM. The aspects of the game that you enjoy as a player will probably also be the aspects of the game that you focus on the most as a GM. So figuring out who you are as a player is going to help you figure out who you are as a GM. Just for example, I love a good story. When I was playing in a game and there was, plot twists and things going on, that's what excited me. Interesting NPCs excited me as a player. And guess what? As a GM, my games have a strong focus on colorful NPCs and interesting stories. Who I was as a player definitely carried over to who I am as a GM. So figuring this stuff out will help you start to identify, well, what's likely going to be the best game you're going to run. As a player, rules are important, and I followed the rules, and, I, like a lot of other players, optimized my character. But it was optimized so that I could do fun things in the game. The rules were somewhat secondary to me. And as a GM, same thing. There's a certain flexibility with the rules. I'm going to go in the direction of what's going to enhance the player's experience rather than rules lawyering my own game. And so who I was as a player transferred over to who I am as a GM. And what you're going to find as you start to think about this stuff is it permeates a lot of different aspects of how you're going to approach things. You're going to realize that as a GM, you have strengths, things that you're really good at, and weaknesses, things that you're not so good at. And this is super important because what's some of the most common advice given to new GMs out there? This is in YouTube videos, this is on blogs, this is in Facebook groups. One of the most common pieces of advice that you're going to receive, as a new GM is, you need to have a session 0, which not a bad thing, and ask your players what it is they want to play. Also not necessarily a bad thing. But now the expectation that's being said is that whatever game your players want to play, that's going to be the game you run. Okay, that doesn't necessarily sound bad on the surface. But when you start to dig in deeper to that particular piece of advice, you do start to find some problems. Because, this assumes certain things. This assumes that you can be a chameleon, that you're going to be good at running every kind of game there is. Episode of the week, you're good at that. You can do that. Sandbox game, absolutely, you're good at that too. A more linear plot-driven game, awesome. You're also great at that too. You're great at combat, you're great at exploration, you're great at puzzles, you're great at social encounters, you're great at voice acting. This advice assumes that you're going to be good at a lot of different things and that you can change your colors based off of whatever it is your players suggest the game should be. For a new GM, that's a lot of pressure. You're just figuring out how to run things, how to run a solid combat, how to put together an adventure. You're still focused on the basics. And now you have to be a chameleon on top of all of that? I think this advice is very, very well-meaning. But I think it does miss some things, that I think are going to be very important. Because maybe the game your players want to play in is not the game you actually want to run. Maybe it's also not the game that you're going to be good at running. Because remember what I was talking about earlier, who you are as a player informs who you are as a GM. So when you're starting off being a GM, chances are you're going to have certain areas of strength. The areas of the game that most interested you as a player are probably going to be things that you're going to be at least okay at as a GM because you already think in that kind of way. But what if the things that your players want are actually parts of the game that you never really thought much about? Or maybe they actually are weaknesses of yours. The game that you're going to be best at running may not match up with the game most desired by your players. And that's okay. Because you're a human being. You're not a chameleon. You're not necessarily going to be great at everything. And that's to be expected. Unfortunately, there's a lot of common advice out there that puts a lot of pressure on GMs to be everything. And one of my points of the video is to point out that that's just not always possible, and it's also not going to be realistic. Now, I think this advice is well-meaning, but let's consider where it likely originates from. There was a time not that long ago where D&D wasn't very popular. Things like Critical Role, Stranger Things has really brought D&D into the spotlight. But that wasn't always so. It used to be that it was the very small minority of people who were playing D&D. There weren't a lot of players, and there were even fewer GMs. And so there was a point in time in gaming history where GMs had no choice. They had to be a chameleon. If they weren't, no one was going to play a game, and no one was going to get to play a game they wanted to play. And so GMs had to be more well-rounded. They had to be more generalists rather than specialists. But things have evolved since that point. There's a lot more players in the fold now. There are many more people, trying and learning how to be GMs. And so there's actually a much more broader availability. You can go onto online forums now and find a game. I could go onto, let's say, the Fantasy Grounds forums, go into their classified section, and I can find a game to play in. If you're a GM looking for players, you can come up with a concept, go into the forum, and do a search for players. It's a much easier time to be a player and a GM today than it has ever been in the past. There's so much more availability, which now means, that pressure to be that do everything GM, that generalist, that chameleon is not as necessary. You can be a specialist. You can run a game that plays to your strengths and find players who are interested in those strengths. And this way you're finding the best possible scenario for the best possible game. And we're going to talk in a little bit why that in and of itself is important. Because, that old advice that you need to run whatever game it is that your players want, it really assumes that you like what all of your players like. And it assumes that your best game is going to be whatever your players like. Because it's just not reality. Reality is, what if you don't like what they want to run? What if it's something that just really doesn't interest you? Something that doesn't excite you? Let's play the tape out. Let's say you're a GM and you're going to be running a game based on something you're not interested in. What is that game going to look like? It's probably not going to be very good. Your heart's not going to be in it. You're not going to be excited about running it. And your players are going to feel that lack of energy, that lack of excitement. Maybe your NPCs are not going to have the same level of flavor and flair. The plots are not going to be as well thought out. Or for those who are plot aversive, your scenarios are not going to be as well thought out. Maybe you're just going to phone it in. Why? Because you're running something your heart isn't in. And this is sort of the crux of what I want to talk about today. As you find your identity as a GM and you start to understand who you are as a GM and what you're good at and what you're not good at, you can now start figuring out, well, what are going to be the best games for you to run? What is going to be your best game that you can present to your players? And it's not going to be everything. We all have strengths. We all have weaknesses, like I mentioned earlier. And your best game is going to be the one that plays to your strengths. Now, does this mean that you can never become more of a chameleon, more of a generalist? Of course not. I think as GMs gain more experience, as GMs, study the game more, their weaknesses become less and less. You know, 10 years ago when I first started, there were some skills that I possess today that I definitely did not have then. Some of the things that were very much a weakness then, are less of a weakness today. Why? Because I read about GMing. I watch videos about GMing. I go onto these forums and I, read back and forth between the various opinions. I've become a student of the game. And so the things that were once problems for me are less so today. Whereas when I first started, I was very much a specialist. I would still consider myself a specialist today, but I'm much more of a generalist than I ever have been. Because through my experience and through my study, I've been able to fill in some blind spots. I've been able to enhance parts of the game that maybe weren't as important to me in the beginning, that maybe I wasn't as well versed in when I started. And that all came from being a student of the game, willing to learn, and also came with time and experience. For new GMs just starting out, I think that's an unrealistic expectation and pressure to put on someone. So what I want like a new fresh GM just starting out today to do is start thinking about, well, who are you as a player? And how is that going to translate to you as a GM? And how to play into that in order to create the best game that you can run. Because at the end of the day, more GMs need to run the game they want to run. The one that they're going to be good at running. Because guess what? The happier your GM is, the happier you are as a GM, the more they're going to want to keep GMing. The more they're going to be excited about GMing. The less likely they are to want to bail on it or experience burnout. I think the GMs most at risk for burnout are the ones who really aren't excited about what they're playing and what they're running. I'm not going to say that's universal, but I'm certain that it's a factor into why some GMs eventually throw in the towel. They're not really running the game that they want to run. All right, so I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk a bit about, bad GMs, good GMs, great GMs, all that kind of stuff. And you're going to see a lot of stuff out there, in forums and in some videos about what qualifies as good GMs, bad GMs, all that kind of stuff. Now, bad GMs, if I had to define a bad GM, and there's a lot of different factors that can contribute to bad GMing. First and foremost is just bad fundamentals. You're just not good at the very basic things that it takes to run a good game. And I would sort of throw into that category that whole like GM versus players, the GM always imposing their sort of only ways of doing things on their players. A lot of the common things that you see in the forums, a lot of the common complaints probably fall into this category of bad GM fundamentals. I think another contributor to bad GMing is when the GM's heart's not in it. This is the forever GM, the person who is the GM but would actually prefer to be a player. They're running the game that their players want, but they don't really want to run the game that they're actually running. It doesn't really interest them, but it's what their players want, so they're running it. And so their heart's not just in it. And like I said earlier, if your GM's heart is not in the game that they're running, chances are that game's going to suck. Not because they're a bad GM, but because their heart's not in it. And just to sort of go on a little tangent here, why is this important? Why does this end up being a problem? Being a GM is a lot of work, a lot of investment. It takes a lot of time to prepare a game for a group of players. Depending on the level of preparation, that you prefer as a GM, you could spend hours just prepping one session. That's a huge investment. And the more your heart's in what you're doing, the easier that investment becomes. The more your heart isn't in it, that becomes a drag. And over time, as a GM, you might put less and less effort into that because you're going to have a hard time motivating yourself to put that time and energy into something that you just don't have your heart in. So this idea of having your heart not in the game being run, I think is a definite contributor to what some might see as a bad GM. It's not that they're necessarily bad, it's just their heart's not in it. Sometimes you can also have a mismatch. Not every player and every GM are a good match for one another. Your best game may not be the game your player wants. And so you're going to not necessarily gel very much. And so sometimes you can see a bad situation develop in a group because you have a mismatch. Either a mismatch between the GM and the players, a mismatch between the game and the players, a mismatch between the game and the GM. There's so many different potential areas of mismatch. And so if you do have a mismatch going on, that can lead to a bad gaming experience, and that GM being, sort of labeled as a bad GM because things are just not working. And the final thing I would sort of throw in here, and this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but sometimes you can just have a bad idea. Sometimes the idea you have in your head for the game that you want to run seems really great up here, but when you actually start executing it, it just doesn't work. Either because of bad execution, or it was just not a great idea in the first place. And especially if this is your player's first time experiencing you as a GM, you might end up getting labeled as a bad GM just from either just one bad idea or bad execution of said idea. So these are some things that can go into, I think, being a bad GM. So what is a good or solid GM? I think someone who's solid at being a GM, and I'm making a distinction between being a solid GM, a good GM, and a great GM. I think someone who's solid, has solid fundamentals. You've got you've got at least a passable sort of knowledge and execution of the basic things you need to do as a GM. You can run and execute a decent game. Maybe you're not really running the game that you want to be running. Maybe you're that forever GM who really would prefer to be a player. And so your heart isn't necessarily in it. But, you've got solid fundamentals. You can adjudicate a game in a fairly good fashion. And so you're solid. And I think a lot of GMs fall into this category. I've experienced GMs like this. There's not a lot of flair. There's not a lot of heart in it, but they execute a fundamentally good game. There's nothing I can really point to and say this person is a bad GM. I'm bored because it's lacking a lot of the heart that I think goes into a better game, but it's solid. Good GMs, I think, have good, solid fundamentals, but they're also running a game that their heart's in. They bring in an excitement to the table that's hard for their players to miss. And that excitement translates to just more interesting things happening in the game. And right here is why this conversation we've been having is so important. When you discover your identity as a GM and you start figuring out the things that you're good at and the best game that you can run, chances are you're going to run a better game because you're going to run a game that plays to your strengths. It's going to be something that your heart is in, something that you're going to be excited about. And that's going to translate over to what you bring to the table. The energy that hopefully will become infectious to your players. And so having that match between who you are as a GM and the game that you're running as a GM, I think contributes to a much better experience at the table. Now, the last category is, sort of the great GM. Now, this is the person who I think has excellent fundamentals. This is the person who knows the rules. They're good at adjudicating stuff on the fly without having to bury their face in the book. They're good at balancing, the challenge of the game, with making sure their players are having an enjoyable experience. Probably one of the quintessential people that we think of who does this is Matt Mercer. He balances so many things so well in the games that he has and that he runs. he obviously believes in the game that he's running. He's running a game that he's passionate about. Um, I honestly wonder, would Matt Mercer be as excellent of a GM if he was running something his heart wasn't in? If somebody handed him something, and this is not just like a one shot. I mean, I think a lot of folks will run one shots that aren't necessarily up their alley, and they can, show up and put a lot of energy into it because it's just one game. I'm talking about running a campaign week after week. I wonder if he would be as great if he wasn't as passionate about what he was running, if he didn't believe in what he was running. So I think that's part of what makes him so excellent and what makes him sort of the GM that we all look up towards. He has excellent fundamentals and he's incredibly passionate about what he's running, and he clearly believes in the game that he's running. But here's the other thing that I think also makes him seem like such a great GM. His players. He's got a great group of players, an amazing mix of players. He makes them look better and they make him look better. You've got a really good match between him as a GM and his players. There's a lot of talk about the first campaign and the early sessions of the campaign, when they had a problem player in the group, and about how there were some challenging sessions in there. You didn't have a good match there. I mean, I can't speak on whether or not that individual was a bad player. Could be that in a different setting with a different GM, maybe he'd be excellent. But it wasn't necessarily a great match, and there was a lot of tension and uncomfortable moments in those early sessions. Things that got hammered out later on, after this individual left. So we can't underestimate the power of having a good match between the GM and the players involved. So sometimes what we think of as great GMs are also a product of the players they have the pleasure of GMing for. So we can't discount that element within all of this as well. So before I wrap up this video, I want to comment on one potential piece of criticism that I think this video could generate. Is that I'm telling GMs that they need to be more selfish. Yes and no. I think sometimes GMs need to be more selfish than they are, especially the one who's trying to be everything to every player. At the end of the day, you need balance. And this is true of not just being a GM, this is just true of life in general. The more we are one thing or the other, the more out of balance that we are, generally the more unhealthy we are, the more unhappy we are, and the more the things we do tend to suffer. So I'm not telling you as a GM that you shouldn't be considering your players' wants and needs. As a matter of fact, going back to that whole idea of, Robin's, different types of players and Angry's 8 types of fun, I actually recommend for GMs to start thinking about who are your players. I actually ask my players to read this and have them sort of self-assess, what categories do they feel they fall into. Because understanding your players and who they are will definitely inform some of the choices you can make as a GM. This is once again one of those fundamentals. I think knowing your players, who they are, what they like in the game, will help you create a better game for them, but within a certain framework. This is where I think it's okay as a GM to be a little selfish. You need to run a game that you feel good about. You need to run a game that you find fun. You want to run the best game that you can run. But you don't want to do that completely blind to your players and ignoring necessarily the things that they want and need. It's not, your way or the highway when it comes to being a GM necessarily. There needs to be some degree of compromise. Now, just to give you an example from my own experience, I've always wanted to run a Deadlands Reloaded game using the Savage Worlds rule set. I've been wanting to do this for longer than I've been a GM. I got exposed to Deadlands a long time ago, and it's one of those things I've really just wanted to run. I've pitched it to my players on a number of occasions, and they really weren't interested in that. It just we weren't able to get a consensus on it, and so I've never been able to run it as a GM. What they were interested in was they wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons, and it's like, okay, cool. I'm down with running a Dungeons and Dragons game. And so they chose the rule set and the system that we were going to play with it. I then decided the game we were going to run, or specifically the game that I was going to run. I took into consideration sort of the general sort of area they wanted to play in. And then I thought about, well, okay, these are the things that I think I would be interested in running. These are the things I think I would be good at running, and I gave my players some choices. So here's option A, B, and C. These are the things that I'm interested in running that I think I can run a good game with. Which ones would you be interested in playing? And so there was some give and take. I didn't just ask my players, okay, what game do you want to play? And then just run that. No, I took into consideration myself. I need to be having fun as well. And you as a GM also need to have fun in whatever game that you're going to run. I need to be excited. I need to be passionate about what I'm running. Because if those elements aren't there, I'm just going to be phoning it in. Just for an example, if I had to run an episode of the week campaign, it bores me even just thinking about it. I like things where things are building upon one another, where players are slowly uncovering different elements in the world that I'm putting together, and in the NPCs and the villains that are part of my world. I like how, a year later, I can call back to something from the first session and it connects in some way. I enjoy interweaving plot lines, bringing in character threads from their backgrounds into the game, and having everything weave together into one narrative. If I had to run an episode of the week campaign where what happened last week doesn't really matter this week, I'd be bored out of my mind. I don't think I could run it. And so I don't run that kind of game because it's not who I am as a GM. And part of this may also being honest with your players. Being able to talk about them. These are my strengths. These are my weaknesses. And it gives you and your players a chance to figure out, well, does that work? Remember what I said earlier. Not every GM and every player is going to be a great match. You might, as a GM, might have to compromise a little, and they as a player might have to compromise a little in order to find, a path forward and to find the best game for you as a GM and for them as a group. And it's possible that you might actually reach an impasse where you come to realize that it's actually not a good fit. The game that they need to have may not be the game that you're capable of running. Or let me rephrase that, not the game that you're capable of running well. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want to see. We want to see you running a game that you believe in, that you can run well, and that you're going to want to show up week after week for and put in that large investment of time and effort. So am I telling you to be a little selfish? Yes. But I'm not telling you to be completely selfish. You want to have conversations with your players. You want to talk about what it is they're interested in and find areas of compromise. This way both you and your players can be satisfied with the game that's going to be played for the next few weeks, months, years. Some campaigns can go on a long time. And I think those long-lived campaigns are a product of a GM and players who have open dialogue, there's compromise, but everybody's excited about what's being run. It's not a GM who's just running something someone else told them they had to run, but it was something that they all came up with together. All right. I know this is probably sort of a controversial topic, coaching GMs to be a little less giving to their players and a little bit more selfish and taking care of their own needs. Feel free to comment. If there is enough questions or comments that come up, maybe I'll do a follow-up video on this. But thank you if you hung in this long. I know it's been a long video, but I think it covers a really important topic. So hope folks found this useful, and until next time.